There is a lot going on in Texas, and here to talk about voter turnout and maybe an election possibly, we have Tiffany Muller, president and Citizens United and Let America Vote, and Greg Casar, that's Austin City Council member and movement organizer who also happens to be a Democratic candidate for Congress in Texas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, oh my goodness. So right now, a lot of things are going on in Texas, a lot of issues, but definitely let's, I guess, first focus on voting. Voters already seem to be falling victim to the state's restrictive voting laws. Tiffany, what do you think people need to know?
Well, first they should know that SB 1, the bill that was passed in the Texas legislature, is working exactly as it was intended, which is to make it harder for voters to vote and to access the ballot box. We're seeing rejection rates of mail ballots leading up to this primary in March, up to 50% in some counties like El Paso County. And this is hitting elderly voters the hardest. Voters who have been voting by mail for decades and now don't fully understand the new law and all the requirements on ID. And look, this bill was created to make it harder to vote. That's exactly what it's doing. And we have seen this pattern continue from Republican legislators across the country. So voters need to know that to be able to protect themselves and make sure their vote is counted, to contact their local election officials, to go to websites like vote.org, and to be really persistent. Don't give up. We are seeing voters be rejected and have to go back again and again to make sure that their ballots are counted. It's really, really unfortunate, Adrienne.
It definitely sounds unfortunate, particularly given that we've seen so many really controversial, very important issues coming out of Texas. And I know people want to have their say, and they also want to be able to pick the candidates and the individuals who will be representing them. And Greg, given that you are running for office there, how does this sit with you in terms of having these complicated issues with the ballots themselves?
Fact of the matter is, when we should have been taking care of people during the pandemic, making sure people didn't lose their homes or their jobs or even their loved ones, the legislature focused on taking away people's right to vote. When the power went out here in Texas and people were freezing in their homes, some of my constituents without water, not just for days, but for weeks, what the legislature focused on was virtually banning abortion care and discrimination against trans kids. And so people want to turn out in protest of those sorts of policies, but we have to make sure we're doing the extra work to get them to the polls. We've seen, as we talked about, the rejection in mail-in ballots. Also, a lot of community groups have essentially had to sort of tailor their GOTV efforts to be more limited so they don't fall under the vague criminalization of quote unquote vote harvesting. And so it is having a real impact, but what we have to do is not give up, because that's exactly what the regime that controls the state wants. What we have to do is double down our efforts, especially to turn out younger voters.
Yes, and I know that there are a lot of younger voters who want to use their voice, but they're also seeing a lot of efforts being put in by the GOP, whether it goes for redrawing maps, gerrymandering, SCOTUS right now with that Alabama gerrymandering decision, all of these efforts that are put in the way. I guess, where do you think people should go with this in terms of their thought about being a part of a process that seems rather corrupt? Tiffany?
Well, Adrienne, you're exactly right to point out the pattern that we are seeing. The Supreme Court has allowed everything from unlimited and undisclosed money into our politics to racial gerrymandering to gutting the Voting Rights Act. We've seen Republicans in Congress filibuster and block all efforts at protecting our democracy and protecting the fundamental freedom to vote. And we've seen Republicans across the country and state after state pass these bills to make it harder to vote, which we're seeing the real world implications of right now in Texas. And so for voters, it can be really hard to figure out where should they go, where should they have hope. Number one, the Senate can still act. Congress can still act to actually protect that fundamental freedom to vote, and they need to. While the Freedom to Vote Act didn't pass in January, there is still time. We could still get it done. Number two, on the state level, they need to contact their state representatives, their state senators, and continue to organize and to raise up their voice. And most importantly, we need to make sure that we have champions of our democracy in office. which is why we are so busy making sure that we are helping to elect champions who are going to fight for these issues once they get elected, because we are seeing an all-out coordinated attack from the other side. And it's one of the reasons we're also so proud to be supporting Greg in his race, because we know he's going to go be a voice for the people.
Yes, and Greg, and I know you're out there, campaigning, trying to make sure that you get to represent the people. Then, can you tell us a little bit about your platform? What really distinguishes you and what you can bring to the table?
I think this campaign really is about what Tiffany just mentioned, what End Citizens United is doing, which is all about how it is that we can actually make our democracy work for us. Because on top of all of the legalized voter suppression tactics we see out there, we also are seeing lower voter turnout in a lot of progressive areas and communities of color, because they want to see and haven't gotten to see as much change as we need from our government here in the last few years. As the cost of living goes up in places like Texas, as childcare becomes harder to get by, and they want to see the Democratic Party be able to actually deliver change for communities. Because when you don't see your democracy actually reflective of what people want, then it makes people not believe in a system for good reason, that a system, if it continues to fail them. So that's why I think it's so important for us to do things like end the filibuster and actually deliver a $15 an hour minimum wage at a minimum, deliver good union jobs for people, restore reproductive rights in Texas. And restoring voting rights is a critical way for us to get to all of those things that we want and need. Another thing that people don't talk about as much as a voter suppression tactic that is fully legalized, especially in a place like Texas, is the lack of immigration reform since I was basically born. In my community, I go to a PTA meeting, and basically the most active parents, the people that are giving the most, oftentimes have been barred from voting, even if they've lived here longer than I've been alive.
Wow, and I'm sure that's extremely disheartening for individuals who are contributing to our society, and yet they do not have a voice in terms of who represents them. And so, Tiffany, I know that in being the president of End Citizens United and the other organizations, that you are working and fighting hard to essentially create that access so that voters' votes actually do count, and that they're not necessarily manipulated by the corruption that is already kind of in the system. And so as it comes to moving up toward these midterms, to these upcoming elections, what is front and center for you in terms of on the agenda to ensure that your agenda plays out the way we all hope it will?
Well, I think what Greg just said is exactly right. Voters want a government that's working for them. And right now, what they see too often is that they're working harder and harder, and they feel like they're falling further and further behind, that their voice doesn't matter, that their vote doesn't really matter. And sadly, too often they're right. We see prescription drug prices continuing to skyrocket. We see that we can't address climate change, that frankly, too much of our government, both at the state and federal level, has been captured by big corporate special interest who's driving the agenda and driving the policy outcomes. And so at End Citizens United and Let America Vote, our mission's pretty simple. We want to get big money out of politics, and we want to make sure everyone has equal access to the ballot box. And so we're going to keep fighting for any changes we can get passed on the federal level. We're going to fight the voter suppression that we're seeing on the state level. But we're also, leading up to these midterms, going to be really focused on making sure that voters understand who is out there fighting for them, who is going to go be a voice to protect the foundations of our democracy. And that is what we're going to focus on, is making sure that voters actually know who's on their side.
Yes, and the thing is, I find that at least in the last few years, a lot of voters, they almost went with who they thought more reflected them as opposed to who was on their side, even if it wasn't necessarily in their best interest to support that particular candidate. Do you see that as a potential problem?
Absolutely. I think that we have had a government that is plagued by dysfunction and gridlock, where nothing is getting done. And nothing's getting done because of obstruction and because of the filibuster in the US Senate, and because it's designed for nothing to get done for the people. And so, people rightfully get frustrated, and they basically are like, that's why we see swing elections, right? I'm gonna vote for change, and I'm gonna vote for change, and I'm gonna vote for change, because they're just hoping that something will create the breakthrough to actually get that responsive government that they want. But in order to do that, we actually have to have the foundations of democracy that create a representative government. That means we have to get the money out of politics. That means we have to make sure that it's one voice, one vote. And we have to end the racial and partisan gerrymandering that we're seeing. Without having those things in place, we can't truly have a government that's working for the people.
Yes, here. I definitely agree with that. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but Greg, I wanted to give you a chance, essentially an open platform. What would you like the people to hear from you?
We have the first primaries in the country happening right now in Texas. It'll all be over on Tuesday. And we've heard such a doom and gloom sort of that progressives and real change isn't going to happen this year, but we don't need to play into that. And so we want to send a strong message to the country that we can actually make change. And if it happens here in Texas, I think that has implications for the rest of the country. On The Intercept today, they published a poll showing our campaign far ahead, a poll done independently of any of our campaigns. And I think it shows that Texas isn't a red state, it's an under-organized state. And if we invest the resources and the time to get working Texans and communities of color out to vote, we can make real change here, which will impact the rest of the country.
Fantastic. And if people want to support you, find out more about you, where can they go?
They can go to casarforcongress.com, CASAR for Congress.com. Thank you all so much for having me on, and thanks to and Citizens United for everything you do.
Thank you so much for joining us. And Tiffany, if people want to get more information on End Citizens United, where should they go?
Thank you so much. EndCitizensUnited.org. Go to EndCitizensUnited.org and join us in this fight.
Yeah, well, you heard it, everybody. Definitely join it. Support these individuals, support their organizations. We need to have change and we need people to invest in making it. Thank you both so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.